The description that God is egoless may seem to be a poor one. It conveys no sense to the ego-ridden mind. People want to be told that God dwells somewhere in the sky, in a world of great splendor, surrounded by wonderful beings called gods or angels. Even to understand that God dwells in their own hearts, men take time. Even there, they want to make a distinction between God and the self. It seems to them a blasphemy to think of God as the self. Egolessness is impersonality. Now we shall ask ourselves a question: which is greater, personality or impersonality? Personality seems to be something and impersonality nothing. But that is because we do not easily see that personality is limitation to a body, while impersonality is just the absence of all limitation. In both, there is the same consciousness. Personality is consciousness cabined, cribbed, and confined, and impersonality is consciousness as it really is, unconfined, infinite, and pure. We see thus that impersonality and personality are opposed like light and darkness, like freedom and bondage, or knowledge and ignorance, or similar to the mathematical signs plus and minus. Which is plus and which is minus? After what we have heard from the sages, we cannot be in doubt about the answer. Impersonality, egolessness, is plus, and personality is minus. Impersonality is consciousness undiminished. It is existence in its entirety, existence as pure consciousness. This existence is made into the three, soul, God, and world, by the mind. The sage explained it as follows. Existence plus variety is the world. Existence plus individuality is the soul. Existence plus the idea of all is God. In all the three, existence is the sole element of reality. Variety, individuality, and allness are unreal. They are created and imposed on existence by the mind. Existence transcends all concepts, including that of God. Inasmuch as the name God is used, the concept of God cannot be true. The truth about God is most faithfully expressed as I am. The Hebrew name of God, Yehovah, which means I am, expresses the truth of God perfectly. So says the sage of Arunachala. The sage also drew pointed attention to the mystery sentence that occurs in the Bible, which is said to have been uttered by God himself. The story there is about the vision of a light that appeared to Moses. Out of that light, a voice speaks to him, instructing him to lead his people out of Egypt. Moses desires to know who it is that speaks to him, so he begs to be told, so that he may tell his people. And the voice tells him, I am that I am. This is the only sentence in the whole book, the whole of which is printed in capital letters, as the sage pointed out. It must be of great significance. And so the sage tells us that in this sentence, God has given out the secret of his own nature, that God, he, is just the I am, which is the ever-shining light of consciousness in our hearts. In other words, God is the self. That the one self alone is true, and all else is superimposed on it by ignorance, has been clearly stated by the sage in many ways and on many occasions. Atman, the self, is the real consciousness, and the persons and things of the world appear by the ascription of names and forms to it. This is expressed in the following statement by the sage. The self, who is consciousness, is alone real, and nothing else. All so-called knowledge, which is manifold, is only ignorance. This ignorance is unreal, since it has no existence of its own, apart from the consciousness which is the self, just as the unreal jewels made of gold have no existence apart from the real gold. What is here referred to as knowledge is the world itself. The world, we have seen, is not other than the thoughts that arise and pass in the mind. These thoughts are described as knowledge by the ignorant, because they think that there is an outside world which the mind knows through the senses. The totality of this knowledge is not only ignorance, but also non-existent. This we can now understand, because the ego's sense is the origin of it all. Besides, ignorance is a negation, and negations do not exist by themselves. This ignorance, consisting of views about a non-existent world, is nothing but the consciousness that is the self, plus the names and forms created by the mind. These names and forms, says the sage, are unreal, like the names and forms imposed on gold, calling it jewels, when in fact it is gold all the time. It is to be noted that the sage purposely employs the word unreal and real to qualify jewels and gold. Jewels are not commonly thought of as unreal, but here the purpose is to illustrate the unreality of the manifold knowledge which is the world. The words are put in here to make the parallelism complete and accurate. If these words were not there, some misguided disciple would twist the meaning and make it out that the sage teaches the reality of names and forms. The same teaching is conveyed in the following way when the sage said, "The reality is like the lighted screen on which move the pictures, like in a cinema show. The soul, the world, and God are like the pictures that move. The infinite alone, like the lighted screen, is real. It is pure, without difference. Though these pictures are unreal, they are not different from reality. But reality is different from them because reality exists without them in its state of unity, in the egoless state. He that sees the unreal appearances does not see reality. He that sees reality does not see the unreal appearances. The mind becomes deluded because it loses hold of the immovable self, which is like the unmoving screen, and sees one of the moving pictures as itself, and the other pictures as the other souls and the world. It will appear from this that the soul, the seer of the world, is inseparable from the world, which is his spectacle. The whole is a creation of the ego. The whole of this teaching was given by the sage to an American disciple in the following words: only one consciousness, equally distributed everywhere. You, through illusion, give this consciousness unequal distribution. No distribution, no everywhere. In this particular instance, the sage spoke in English, and the above are the very words spoken by him. Here in the first sentence, the ideas of distribution and everywhere had to be admitted. But in the third sentence, the sage makes it clear that they too are illusions, because they are the creations of the ego mind. The self of the egoless state is often called the great self, thereby distinguishing it from the pitiful little self that appears in the three states. But the sage tells us that the true distinction thus expressed is not between great and little, but between real and false. The great self is the real self, Atman. The other little self, the ego self, does not really exist. This little self is displaced by the real one when the ego dies because it is false. The sage is often loosely described as one that knows the self. But this is not intended to be taken in a literal sense. It is a tentative description, intended for those that believe ignorance to be something that exists. And so they are told that this ignorance is to be gotten rid of by winning knowledge of the self. There are two misconceptions in this. One is that the self is an object of knowledge. The other is that the self is unknown and needs to be known. The self, being the sole reality, cannot become an object of knowledge. Also, being the self, Atman is never unknown. The ancient lore tells us that Atman is neither known nor unknown, and the sage confirmed it. How can this be? The self is the pure I am, the only thing that is self-manifest. And by its light, all the world is lighted up. But the self seems to be unknown and to need to be known because it is obscured by the world and the ego. What is needed is to remove these. The sage explains this by the analogy of a room that is encumbered with unwanted lumber. If space be wanted, all that is needful is to clear out the lumber. No space has to be brought in from outside. So too, the ego mind and its creations have to be emptied out, and then the self alone will remain, shining without hindrance. What is loosely called knowing the self is really being egoless and the Atman. Thus, the sage does not know the self, he is the self. This Upanishadic truth that the self is the deathless, self-existent reality is also proved, so we are told by the sage, by the very fact of common experience, which, however, has been described as something anomalous. We all know that death is certain, but we ignore it and act as if there were no death. And this is accounted as a strange thing. But if we take into account the teaching of the sage, namely that we as the real self are deathless in fact, what is there strange in this? This is an indication that the self never really became bound or confined, never really lost its nature as reality. The real self is therefore neither non-existence nor unconsciousness. This real self or Atman is existence and consciousness. Sat Chit. It is also defined as happiness or bliss, Ananda. Here again we have to be aware of notions that belong to the world of the ego. The self is impersonal, and therefore it is happiness itself, and not someone that is happy. The self that is happy is not so at all times. That is the little self. And sometimes this little self, through identification, is miserable and is more happy at one time than another. This we have seen in a previous chapter. The real self in the egoless state is not at all like this so-called happy man. Happiness is of the essence of the self's nature, like existence consciousness. Just as the self is the original of all existence and of all consciousness, wherever manifested, so Atman is the original of all the happiness, chiefly in the form of pleasure that is experienced by ego minds.